Hello everybody, thank you for coming along this evening. My name's Kirsten Wayner. I'm the head curator of the National Museum of Australia's People and the Environment program, and I have the enjoyable privilege of welcoming you to the museum tonight and just introducing the evening's entertainment. So thank you first for coming along to participate in this evening's forum, exploring and I think also celebrating the life and legacy of the late environmental activist, writer and philosopher Val Plumwood. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight. And I'd also like to pay respect to their elders, past and present, and to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are in the audience today. So this evening's program, which has been developed in partnership with Greg Borschmann of ABC Radio National, brings together three of the National Museum's core roles: to develop Australians' understanding of their interrelationships with their environments, to research and interpret collections relating to Australia's history and culture, and also to act as a place that brings people together in conversation about national issues. That's you guys. The National Museum was founded with the central theme of the quote, "the history of man and nature in this continent, their linked roles and their interactions." A phrase that we might now gloss 40 years later as the history of people's interrelationships with their environments. Since that founding statement, this vision has inspired the museum to explore and interpret how Australian life arises through the intertwined histories of Indigenous Australians, non-Indigenous Australians, and the plants, animals, and natural forces of this continent. Because we're a museum, we approach this history making through the medium of objects and collections. The National Historical Collection includes a wide variety of materials that record diverse aspects of people's perceptions and understandings of the non-human world, of their efforts to change it to reflect their beliefs and ambitions, and also of the non-human world's capacity to demand response, adaptation and affection. Val Plumwood's canoe, which is on display here tonight, and about which we'll hear a lot more in a minute, is one fabulous example of these collections that speak to all these trajectories in Australian history. Val Plumwood's deeply thought engagement with and reflection on the place of humans in and as part of the non-human world is a natural focus for the National Museum and particularly for the People and the Environment program. As we will hear, Val challenged us to rethink assumptions about human separation from and mastery over the rest of the natural world, to develop new stories about how we can perceive, understand and act in more ecologically responsible and sustainable ways. The museum aims to be a place where those stories can come together to be told and retold, and we invite all Australians to engage along with us with Val's challenge to rethink our future. Australians currently face crises that, I would argue, require the radical rethinking of our relationship to the national world. And it's my ambition, at least, that the museum's collections and the knowledge that coheres around them will constitute a significant resource for the kind of historical understanding that can underpin good future thinking and good future choices. And this evening represents, at least for me, one little step on that long journey to new kinds of understanding. So, this evening's program is in two parts. In a minute, I'll hand over to Greg Borschmann, who's here on my left, who will lead a conversation with our panel, which includes National Museum curator George Mayne, anthropologist Deborah Bird-Rose, writer and editor Lorraine Shannon, and crocodile scientist and conservationist Graham Webb. Greg will introduce them a little bit more fully when he gets going. So that's the first part, is a conversation, and then following the panel, I'll be very pleased to invite Professor Kate Rigby to come up to introduce and launch The Eye of the Crocodile, the just published posthumous collection of Val Plumwood's essays. Now, I have to tell you, in case you haven't noticed the cameras, that tonight's conversation is being recorded, and it will in part be developed as a forthcoming Radio National Big Ideas program. Now, your attendance, whether you liked it or not, is considered consent to being recorded. So if you do not want to be recorded, now would be an appropriate time to depart, but please don't. And I'll also just remind you now to make sure that your mobile phone is turned off or on silent. I'll also just ask you to hold any questions during the panel conversation, and if we have time towards the end of the evening, we'll come back and have some time for questions and answers. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Greg. Greg Borschmann is the environment editor of the breakfast program of ABC Radio National. That's the one hosted by Fran Kelly. He started his career in the media as a print journalist in 1974 on the Age newspaper under the great newspaperman Graham Perkin. And he says that he fell into radio almost by accident 13 years ago. Hopefully the bruises have faded by now. However, Greg is no stranger to Canberra, as he spent much of the 1990s working on the People's Forest, which was a very big oral history project over at the National Library of Australia. And it was through this project that Greg got to know Val Plumwood. Apparently, Val wrote an essay for the People's Forest on the philosophy of the forests. During the rather challenging editing process, Greg remembers Val describing him as, quote, "the worst editor I have ever worked with." But I'm relieved to report that Val forgave him when the book was published in 1999. I do understand also that, like Val, in the mid-1980s, after he finished rafting 90 kilometres down the Daintree River in North Queensland in a rubber ducky with no more than a paddle for protection, Greg also acquired a crocodile story, but I understand that's for another day. Maybe we can get him to tell us about it. So, with no more ado, please join me in welcoming Greg and the members of our panel.
Good evening, Canberra, and thank you very much for being here tonight, and thanks especially to the National Museum of Australia for hosting this very special event. Few of us have ever stared into the eyes of a crocodile. Even fewer know what it means to be hunted, not the hunter. In 1985, on the East Alligator River in Kakadu National Park, Australian philosopher Val Plumwood learnt the hard way. As she later wrote, it was, quote, "an experience beyond words of total terror, total helplessness, total certainty, experienced with undivided mind and body of a terrible death in the swirling depths," unquote. Given all that happened on that day, it's remarkable that Val lived to tell her tale. It changed her life, and it deeply challenged her as a philosopher. But no more so than the way Val had long challenged those she saw as the oppressors or the destroyers. She was both activist and academic, philosopher and feminist. She could wage the great intellectual fight for the forests, but also be hands-on friends with a wombat. Val Plumwood died in 2008. We're here tonight at the National Museum of Australia in Canberra to launch a book of Val's writings, The Eye of the Crocodile. And to help us better understand Val Plumwood and her legacy, I'm joined by 4 guests. First, one of the world's leading authorities on crocodiles, Professor Graham Webb. A curator here at the National Museum of Australia, Dr. George Mayne. A writer and book editor, Dr. Lorraine Shannon. And anthropologist and writer, Professor Deborah Bird-Rose. I'd like to start with a crocodile story from each of you. Not everyone has a crocodile story, but I'm sure our panellists all do. Graham Webb, you've been chasing crocodiles since 1970. I know you will have looked directly into the eyes of one or two, and you've possibly even wrestled one or two. What's your croc story?
Well, I think if you go back to 1971, when crocodiles were protected, and there were hardly any left, and those that were left were a few adults well hidden away, extremely wary, you never saw them, and some little baby ones. There was nothing in the middle. And we had assumed that these big wary animals were all wary, that they wouldn't really attack people because they were so frightened of people. And to cut a long story short, we developed a radio tracking thing which we'd put on a big croc that we managed to catch, very rare then, about 4 metre croc. And we went down into the swamp, the mangroves in Arnhem Land, to try and find the animal. And we found it on the other side. And if you can believe this, there's an Australian, an Irishman and an Englishman up this tree.
This is sounding like a good story already.
I wanted the croc to come over so I could see the transmitter. And so I got a stick and splashed in the water. I was the only one out of these 3 that knew anything about crocs. And of course the croc turned around like this, went down, swam all the way underwater, and came right up under the tree. And with the benefit of hindsight, the three of us realised that I was there trying to keep everyone quiet so the croc wouldn't dive and swim away. But we'd all sort of realised that it wasn't going to dive and swim away. And it did. It came launching up this tree. It didn't get any of us, but it came within about this far of the Irishman. And everyone had strange stories to tell about it. But it was quite an awakening for me, because the first time I realised that really these were really serious, dangerous predators. And what I mean, up until then I thought they were not what they'd been posted in the old books to be. But they were, and as a hindsight I can say, when something like that happens, everyone starts to talk in deep voices. If you really get frightened, your voice goes down like this. Everyone's quite a strange thing. But I know what Val would have gone through when she really looked into the eye of a crocodile that you know is attacking you. It's a quite different thing.
Deborah Bird-Rose, you came to Australia in 1980 to live with Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, hoping to learn about country and relationships between people and the land and other species. How could that not include crocodiles? What's your croc story?
Well, my croc story concerns the floodplains out to the southwest of Darwin. And when I first started research out there with people, one of the first things we did was go fishing at a billabong that Graham knows, Pudge Pudge. And, and when they got to the billabong, the old lady started calling out. So I said, what is she calling out for? They said, she's calling out for the crocs. I said, why is she calling out for the crocs? They said, to get them to come up. I said, why do we want the crocs to come up? She said, so we'll go down to the other end of the billabong and go fishing.
Very sensible, very pragmatic. George Mayne, as curator in the People and Environment section here at the National Museum of Australia, I suspect you haven't been out the back on Lake Burley Griffin looking for rogue crocs, but you do. I'm sure you do have a croc story.
Oh yes, mine's quite different, and it's a southern tale. I've got two daughters, and when my second daughter was born, we took our first daughter, who was about 3.5, to a teddy bear shop to buy a teddy bear for our second daughter, who was just born. And we thought this would help, the bonding process. But instead of choosing a cute little fluffy bunny, she chose quite a large fluffy crocodile with a large open mouth and big teeth, and she thought that was an appropriate toy to put in the bassinet with the baby, and we thought that probably revealed something of how she was feeling about the new family member. And she was very cranky when I told her I was going to tell that story tonight, so I'm sorry.
Did the crocodile survive?
Well, yes, it's still a treasured member of the family.
Dr. Shannon, Dr. Lorraine Shannon, as editor of Val Plumwood's book, The Eye of the Crocodile, you had a similar experience of the toy variety. In fact, you were overwhelmed by a boxload of them. How on earth did that happen?
Well, we were trying to find a suitable cover for the book, and we looked at photographs of the eye of a crocodile and Indigenous paintings, but all these possibilities seemed to fall through in one way or another. So I emailed Anne Edwards, who was minding Val's property, and said, could you possibly post up to me some of Val's collection of toy crocodiles, which I knew people had given her over years and years and years. I had seen all these crocodiles around the place. So next thing, this big cardboard box arrived, and we unpacked it, and it was full of the most bizarre collection of crocodiles. We had great big blue, pale, fluffy ones, and tiny little painted tin ones, and wooden articulated ones that sort of clacked. There was even a hot water bottle in the shape of a crocodile. There was pens and pencil sharpeners, everything you can imagine. So we spread them out, and I had a friend taking photographs of them. Nothing worked. They all looked absolutely dreadful. as if we were trying to produce a book on collecting toy crocodiles. So there was one rather lovely stylized wooden carved crocodile, and we put that down on a big red cardboard sheet and photographed it. And that worked well, I think, anyway, and it did become the cover of the book. And I was actually very pleased that the cover showed one of Val's crocodiles along with her text. I thought it was very nice that the cover didn't come from anywhere else, but from her as well.
I'm interested in exploring with all of you what these toys, all this fear and fun and fantasy, tell us about the reality of Crocodilus porosus and our relationship with one of the world's great predators. Deborah Bird-Rose, let's start with a perspective that's not ours, an Indigenous worldview. It's hard to imagine crocodiles not being important, very important, revered and feared creatures in that universe.
Well, that's right. They're big, important figures in real life and in story and in people's interactions with country. They're special. We're talking about the porosus, not the little freshwater crocs. They're sort of like people, you know. They're sort of like what people would be if people lived in the water, and you know, and I think it's probably that predator thing, you know, that one predator recognizes another predator, and there's a lot of respect and a lot of recognition there, a lot of stories about interactions, and a lot of people who, like a meeting with a crocodile is always deemed to have significance. It isn't just like bumping into a goanna or something and taking it home for dinner. Yeah.
So
They matter.
it's within a framework. It's
Yeah.
almost like part of the family.
Well, the reason that old lady who's passed away now could call out to those crocs was because it's her country, and she could address them as countrymen, and people didn't really expect to be taken by crocs as long as they addressed the crocs properly and let them know where they were. So there's some ways in which crocodiles, like a lot of creatures actually, are guardians for country. And if you're the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time,
Look out.
look out. Yeah.
Graham Webb, you've spent a lot of time with Indigenous people in country. What have Indigenous people taught you about crocodiles?
Oh, a lot. But, you know, what Deborah says is very true, that a lot of Aboriginal people, or traditional people at least, see, especially in big crocs, the body of certain people that have passed on. So if a big croc gets killed or drowned or something, it's a very serious event. There's a lot of wailing and carrying on to lament the loss. So they certainly have a way of linking in exactly as you say. But then one group of people that have crocodiles in their totem, for want of a better word, may not be able to eat crocodile meat, but the people next door who don't can eat crocodile meat, and they can live happily ever after together, having completely different views on the value of crocs. But crocs themselves, like the relationship between people and crocs, predates Aboriginals by probably 1 million years. You know, when the first primitive people climbed out of the first tree and went to the first billabong, they were chased away by a crocodile. And it wasn't too long till they learnt to steal the crocodile's eggs. And this relationship's been going on for possibly millions of years. And all I can say is, if you get a newborn baby and hold it up to a crocodile's head on the wall, just hang onto its spine as it turns around. It's never seen one, but it's hardwired. I think that's why crocodiles are so good in the media. You know, as soon as a crocodile comes on, people watch it. Like in Darwin, the newspaper every 3 or 4 days has a crocodile story on the front page because it sells 10% more newspapers. But I think that's not modern man, it's way back somewhere in the hard wiring.
I'm wondering, as a scientist, as a researcher, what you learnt from that Indigenous perspective. Did it help inform the way you did your science or the way you understood your science?
Yeah, you know, I work very closely with Indigenous people. We work together doing this work on crocodiles, and so I was lucky. Yeah, in that society where I was, people had only come out of the bush in the 50s and 60s, and the men were all hunters and the women were all gatherers and hunters, and it was a man type thing where I was with them all the time, and I was trying to do the work and they were helping me, and I learned a huge amount. But the real thing was just coolness. That
Don't
they're
panic.
cool. They're cool people. They're very cautious. They're very skilled hunters. There's not a like I used to think I was pretty good in the bush relative to most white people I've ever met. I'm sure they used to wonder how I'd ever survive. You know, they used to think I was the most incompetent, hopeless person. They would know where to go in a billabong, where safe to swim, where not safe to swim. And it's difficult to cotton on to what, as I'm sure you would have found too, Deborah, is what lies beyond that, what we'd look at as sixth sense. But like it was an amazing period for me. I've worked with Indigenous people ever since, or tried to help protect their rights to have a traditional lifestyle, because a lot of people today want to take it away from them. They think Aboriginal people should be eating, you know, McDonald's and French fries like the rest of us, you know, not out there killing animals and things. So it's an important thing, an important link.
We're going to come to that conservation argument later. Lorraine Shannon, you edited Val's book. For most of us, surviving a crocodile attack would be a triumph in its own right, but Val used the experience in both a personal and professional way. I'm wondering if you had a sense from all of that reading how it affected her. It did change her, but in what way? And I'm wondering if you got a personal sense of that change.
Well, when I first met Val, I knew nothing about her, and I was one of the first things she told me was this story about the crocodile, and I was absolutely mesmerised by it, of course, and it was very clear to me that this had been a completely life-changing event for her. Both in a positive and a negative way. There was obviously a very deep amount of consideration in Val to do with death and predation. And this existed, I think, alongside what I found so attractive about her, which was her almost childlike delight in the world and her sense of how privileged and honoured she was when she had relationships with animals such as her wombat, Burraby. And the sense in which so few of us actually ever get the opportunity to have that sort of relationship with a wild animal, and yet when we do, it contributes so much towards our humanity. I think that was fundamental to her way of thinking.
What was the negative? I found that an interesting thing for you to say. Like, I can imagine, I always imagined that Val used it to challenge herself personally and professionally. What did you sense was the negative for Val?
I remember quite vividly this first conversation that I had with Val when she was talking about it, and she just glanced down at one point and said, yes, there has just been so much death. And at this time, a lot of her hens had been taken by a quoll, and she was very disturbed by and distressed by this and decided she wasn't going to keep hens anymore. So I think that, you know, this sense that there was a way in which we always have to seek to try and reconcile ourselves to the fact that we cannot separate ourselves out from killing, that in order to eat, we must kill to stay alive. Even if it's only plants, it's still taking away the life of something else, and this is just absolutely unavoidable.
And that's something that most of us can push away almost every day, whereas for Val, it was obviously right in her face there. George Mayne, you've had most to do with the telling of the Plumwood story here at the National Museum, and especially the display of Val's canoe, which we see before us here tonight. The canoe that Val was paddling that fateful wet flooding day in 1985, Val saw what she thought at first was a stick that curiously developed eyes and then a nose. And remarkably, at first Val was unfazed, thinking it was a small one. She later wrote, "I was close to it now, but not especially afraid." An encounter that would add interest to the day. What happened? How did Val come to tell the story of that attack? Because it wasn't in the Northern Territory News, but rather a scholarly article, Being Prey, that was published in 1996.
Yes, it took her a long time before she was prepared and emotionally able, I think, to write about the horrific event. It was published in 96 and the attack happened in 85. But she was up there visiting Kakadu on a holiday. She'd been involved in activism work to prevent mining happening in the national park, and she knew some people up there. And towards the end of her stay, she was staying at the East Alligator Ranger Station, where Greg Miles was the ranger, and Greg had used this canoe, which is in front of us now, for some years since he'd started work there as a ranger. It had been owned by the National Park Service there, and he had asked Val to go and have a look at a new trail that he'd marked out, a new walking trail. He knew that Val was a really experienced bushwalker, and he really valued her experience and her advice. And the day seemed to be fine for canoeing. Crocodiles weren't thought to be a problem, as Graham was saying earlier. There weren't many crocodiles around in the 1970s after the generations of hunting, but this was a time when crocodiles were increasing in number, but there hadn't been any attacks in canoes. And so Val set off, and unbeknownst to her and to Greg, there'd been a lot of rain upriver, and the river was rising. Rain was coming in. This was before the days of radars and really reliable weather forecasts. So she actually couldn't find the landmarks that Greg had indicated that she needed to look out for, where the start of the trail was. And then the rain was setting in, and she eventually decided to head back. And that's when the rain was quite heavy, the river was rising even more, and she had this unfortunate encounter with a crocodile that started to attack the canoe, to hit it with its tail, and she decided to leap into a tree and try to escape. And at that point, the crocodile roared up out of the water and pulled her down into what is called a death roll, which is the method crocodiles use to kill their prey, to wind them and to drown them and stun them, to use all the energy that they've got in that in that action. And Val actually had to experience 3 of these death rolls before she was able to clamber up a bank, very wounded, and get away. But I thought I'd just read a few sentences from her account. She, as well as being a wonderful philosopher and committed activist, she was an extraordinary writer, and this is just a few sentences from her account of the death roll. It lasted for an eternity beyond endurance, but when I seemed all but finished, the rolling suddenly stopped. My feet touched bottom, My head broke the surface, and spluttering, coughing, I sucked at air, amazed to find myself still alive. The crocodile still had me in its pincer grip between the legs, and the water came just up to my chest. As we rested together, I had just begun to weep for the prospects of my mangled body when the crocodile pitched me suddenly into a second death roll. And as I mentioned, there was a third before she found a way to escape the crocodile by climbing up the bank and forcing her thumbs into the wall of the bank. And I think it's testament to her ferocity of character and her strength of character that she was one of the few people ever to survive a crocodile attack like that.
That's a remarkable story. Graham Webb, you were in Darwin at the time. Was the attack a surprise to you?
Look, the time that attack came, there were two elements of that. One, actually using canoes in crocodile country is extremely dangerous. And in fact, I had a letter from the government about using canoes in Kakadu, and had written back maybe 6 months before Val got taken, saying it's a very dangerous practice. You shouldn't do it. But as often happens, bureaucracies. There's a lot of history of people being taken out of canoes by saltwater crocodiles around through the range. So that's one side, that it should never really have happened. And two, at the time it happened, the crocs were just starting to recover in the north. They'd been protected in 1971. There were no champions for crocodiles at that time. There were only the hunters really who'd run out of crocodiles that were concerned. There were no real conservation groups at that time. And so nobody minded saying, let's protect the crocodiles, because it was like saying, let's protect the unicorns or something. There were none around, so it didn't matter. But as they started to recover by the end of 79, 80, and we had 4 attacks with 2 fatalities in the space of 12 months, the public started to become really concerned. And when Val got attacked, one of the things that was incredibly important at that time, that I was always very grateful to her, she came, as soon as she could speak from the hospital, she came out very strongly, not wanting people to take it out on the crocodiles. And so at that time, it was a very touch and go thing, the way the public was going with crocs. And her calming of the waters was a very important thing in the north at that time.
I wanted to ask you about that, because we all know what happened to Val, but do you know what happened to that croc? Was it shot? Because you're right, that was one of Val's very main concerns for the croc. She didn't want it shot. What happened to the croc?
I don't know. I don't know whether... There's someone in the audience that might know, but I don't think that... I don't think it was shot. I don't know. It wasn't, yeah. Maybe they couldn't find it. Like in a flooded creek with water pouring down, trying to find the croc is pretty problematic. Like if there's a lot of water running down those creeks into the East Alligator, very difficult.
I'd like to get a sense from all of you, like Graham just mentioned the unicorn there. It's okay to protect the unicorn because there's none around, but the question I'd like to pose is, can a leopard change its spots? Because we hear a lot about the terrible predator man, and yet, as Graham has already told us twice, in 1971 we made a conscious conservation decision. Hunting crocodiles ended, and the intent was to give these ancient animals a chance to recover. And I'd like to get a reflection from you, and perhaps let's start with you, Deborah, on doesn't that show that we are connected with nature, that we are capable of the greatest altruism towards nature and other species, however cute? Because the crocodile certainly didn't have a lot going for it. It wasn't a panda or a koala.
Well, we're certainly capable of a lot of wonderful things, but we're also capable of a lot of terrible things. We're not taking care of pandas, you know, no matter how cute they are. We're not doing a good job with them. We're not taking care of koalas. We're not doing a good job with them. We're not taking care of forests very well. I think that I think Graham's unicorn argument is actually quite inspired. I would imagine that it just wasn't a paying operation anymore. Would that be right? Because we're very good at taking care of things that are peripheral to our interests. We're not so good at taking care of things in a way that would require us to stand back and actually put some limits on the human. Like, we're happy to limit almost anything except ourselves, unfortunately. And it's one of the great lessons that Val wanted everybody to start getting, that humans have to manage themselves as well as think about what's going on with the rest of the world.
Graham, have you got a reflection on that one?
Well, you know, when crocodile hunting restarted, or serious crocodile hunting started, it was in 1945, 46, and there'd just been 60 million people killed in World War II, and conservatively, and there was just nobody who cared about crocodiles worldwide. You know, they ate people. They're awful predators. Like Val, in fact, describes them perfectly well. There's no compassion with a crocodile. It's just a predator. You tear you to pieces if given the chance. So the hunting of crocodiles, just so happened their skin was a good skin and a valuable skin. So the hunting of crocodiles proceeded with, well, you know, something for nothing, and so nobody cared about it. And it continued and continued and continued because they are big predators, instead of being stopped, as it was with our little freshwater crocodile. So by 1971, the only people that were really jumping up and down with it, the relatively few serious hunters, including Ray Petherick from down in that Waggai area. And that was it. That was the sum total of the people that were interested. So they hadn't disrespected crocs. Aboriginal people were involved in the whole hunting all the way through. There was no disrespect for crocodiles. It's just the enlightened side of that is there today wasn't there. And so I guess for most people around the world, the conservation of predators is the biggest challenge there is. It's easy to conserve something like koalas or possums or something that runs around, but when you start trying to conserve things like lions and leopards and tigers that eat people, that eat your kids, crocodiles, it's a big challenge to ask other people to look after them, you know, like, so I can sit here and say in Canberra at bed at night, sleeping more soundly because I know someone else is living with the tigers. Very difficult. So the sort of approach we've taken in the north, I think, has worked. You know, we've brought the crocs back from very, very low numbers, 20 times in abundance and 100 times in biomass. We've got them back to where they were historically, which is unheard of with big predators. And we've done it in an unconventional way, but it's worked, you know.
I'd like to follow that through with you, Graham, because you're not upset by the idea of crocs being farmed, and I'm wondering if you see that as the engine room for this conservation outcome that we've had. For example, Crocodilus Park, which you own and manage, harvests 2,000 crocs a year. It's factory farming. How does it work? Where do the eggs come from? And what happens to all that meat and hide at the end of the process?
Well, you know, if I get back to where I was before, when the crocs started to really recover and eat people again, everyone had realised that when you protect crocs, you protect them to increase the number of crocodiles, without thinking about what are you going to do when you increase the number of crocodiles, which is exactly what's happening with great white sharks in Western Australia. Like, what are you going to do when you fill the rivers with predators again? So we found that we had a huge problem with the public perception of crocodiles. And so at the time it was quite bold that we said, well, the only possible way we're going to win this is if we make crocodiles so valuable to people that they'll see them as an asset rather than a liability. Now, that doesn't mean you can have intrinsic values or you can have utility values. Now, to get everyone to love crocodiles or love wildlife, for example, like Val would propose, it might take 100 years or 200 years before it's going to work. Money values work instantly, just like this. And so we decided to invest in sustainable use, to let people... So our landowners were the first, and that was hard, because the legislation at the time, all wildlife belonged to the Crown. And this whole idea of paying landowners for eggs taken, oh God, this was a major hurdle to get over, but I wouldn't move unless the landowners got first payment. So now what happens is all the landowners, a lot of traditional people in Arnhem Land, every year now, there's over $1 million goes out into the landowners for the collection of eggs. Those eggs come in. There's a farming industry that started that buys the eggs, that then incubates the eggs, raises the animals, sells the animals on, and the whole chain keeps surviving. So now there's a lot of people employed in the north with through crocodiles, directly and indirectly. The landowners all make money from crocodiles. If they have a patch of swamp that's has 10 nests a year, well, they might make $10,000–$20,000 out of that. So they keep the swamp, or they'll even fence it off to stop the cattle coming in, all because there's money. So for me, I like crocs. For me, the value system for me is I just like crocs. I like the aesthetic, I like the intrinsic value of them, but it's not necessarily the value that's going to work pragmatically to save the crocs. I think that's the part people have trouble with. So yeah, sure, the more people that have crocodile skin wallets, have crocodile skin belts, crocodile skin shoes, crocodile skin handbags, the more conservation will be successful. If people don't have any, there is no two bits about it. Nobody's going to put up with them. Well, who would put up with them in Lake Burley Griffin? You know, no one will. So that's the problem, unless you can project the sort of philosophies that Val advanced with such skill, unless you can show how you're going to implement those in the whole of society amongst the people who are living with crocs in a quick time. And I don't think you can do it, you know.
Deborah Bird-Rose, are you comfortable with this argument? The only way we can be trusted to save a species is to exploit it. That's a very Aboriginal attitude, isn't it?
Well, I don't really care for the use of the term exploit as an Aboriginal attitude or value. I mean, I think living with others does mean exchanges of energy and exchanges of metabolism, and that's, you know, that's what Val was trying to say and talking about being part of the feast, that we give and we take. How that works in international commodity chains, I think, is quite another argument. And I was sitting here listening to you, Graham, and thinking, Val would be into you tooth and claw. And I'm sorry that I'm not the philosopher she is to be able to do that. But I mean, I recognize the pragmatism of what you're saying exactly. But at the same time, I mean, what Val was arguing for, not arguing against, but arguing for, was a change in how we humans think, how we behave, how we understand ourselves, how we interact with the world around us, how we interact with each other, and how we actually do the hard work that would let us become a kind of creature that's a benefit to the earth rather than a plague upon it, which is what we seem to be for the most part these days. So if commodification buys us time, maybe that is what it takes. But if commodification is seen as the answer rather than a gap measure, if it's the answer, then we're back on the same treadmill. That's the treadmill we're trying to get off. So that, I think, is in my crude, ineffective way, a kind of thing that Val would probably be saying here.
Lorraine, would you agree? Would Val feel slightly uncomfortable with that use it or lose it argument?
I think quite possibly, yes. I think maybe she would be much more in favour of things that have happened, say, in the States with the reintroduction of wolves that's been so successful in national parks there, where you have an animal which is seen as a natural predator that is essential in a whole ecological system, that top predators, once removed, the entire system starts to disintegrate. So I think it is very important that we start to address the issues of big predators, despite the fact that they do eat us.
It begs the question that if we remove ourselves from the ecosystem, would it collapse? I'd like to explore the early days of Val Plumwood's legacy. And Deborah Bird-Rose, I come to you because Val first carved a name for herself in 1973 with the publication of Fight for the Forests. It was a brave book. It took on the forest establishment of Australia at that time when forestry had not been challenged intellectually, when there were still echoes of timber cutting being a metaphor for manliness, if not godliness. Surprisingly for a budding philosopher, the book aimed squarely at the soft underbelly of the forest profession, the economics. And Val was outraged that a native forest had no value until it was knocked over and converted into a plantation. What does the story of Fight for the Forests tell us about Val Plumwood, the person and the philosopher?
Well, Val and Richard did that together.
Richard was her husband,
Richard Routley, who later became Richard Sylvan, did that together. And I guess one of the things that just awes me about it is the incredible intelligence that the two of them had in the way they worked together. So they had to learn, they were philosophers, they had to learn to understand economics in order to actually analyze and assess whether the economic arguments that the Forestry Commission was putting forward actually held up or not. They had to do a lot of work with maps. They had to become geographers. They had to become biologists. They had to try to understand what was going on in a forest. And of course, they had to continue to be philosophers, because I think part of what drove that and drove some of their later work, some of their early work, but early environmental philosophy work, was that Western philosophy did not seem to be able at that time to provide a coherent argument as to why you would not chop down a forest. And they had the sense that there must be, that there's something wrong with our philosophy if it cannot do that, and that therefore it needs philosophers to work with that question and try to work out what the answers to that question would be. And environmental philosophers have been doing, asking those questions and exploring those questions ever since, of what are the values of others, and what's the cultural context that holds up an idea that it's okay to, if it moves, shoot it, if it doesn't move, chop it down. What makes that seem like it might have been a reasonable way to approach the natural world? So it's sort of the love of forests, the love of the natural world drove these intellectual quests, and it also drove the activism of being out, at the front line, at protests and stuff. They didn't divorce the different parts of their lives. They kept holding it together, and they kept asking these hard questions. And I think the fact that there were two of them must have really helped a lot, actually. But Val's contribution then was really the feminist one, to show how the disregard of nature is linked to the disregard of women, is linked to the disregard of Indigenous people, is linked to the disregard of, well, we could go on and on, mind versus matter, all those kinds of things. She showed how they worked together and actually kind of supported each other, reinforced each other.
Did she get the credit she deserved?
Sorry?
Did she get the credit she deserved for that book?
Well,
it was ironic because it is, even 30 or 40 years later, it's an incredibly dense read, but it was a bestseller. It was quite incredible.
Well, that's good. That's good.
It had a huge impact.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's the good side of the story for sure.
What's the downside? What's the bad
Well,
side?
the downside is that various prominent people in forestry industry and academia tried to get the book quashed. I think that Val's generally not so happy relationship with the ANU, because that was published by ANU Press, I think she bore the brunt of a lot of that anger. 30 years later, when John Dargavel, thank you, organized, like 30 years of the Fight for the Forest, Win, Lose, or Draw, a symposium. And some of the old forestry guys who got up and spoke were still shaking with anger. Like, not shaking with age, shaking with anger over, and Val was there in the audience. It was probably maybe the first time they had a chance to address her, and they were still very angry. So she bore and wore a lot of the anger
That
around
tells
that.
you she fired a very effective bazooka.
Well, yes, she was hardly a defenseless creature in those situations. But, I think people kind of tend to forget that Val, because she was so feisty, because she could do such a good argument, and because she enjoyed a good argument, that she was also human. When people were truly unkind to her, it hurt her feelings, She had a very tender side and a fun-loving side, as Lorraine was saying. And, these things hurt her as well.
Lorraine Shannon, I'd like to come to you because everyone thought that Val was working on a book before she died, and a book about crocodiles and philosophy. And in 2008, when Val did die, you offered to take over the editing of the manuscript. You got her computer. What did you find? I think it was a far more difficult job than you thought you were putting your hand up for.
Well, I think Val's computer files were probably at least as chaotic as my own, and she obviously never envisaged somebody else having access to them. And we had assumed that there was a manuscript that was more or less complete. What was the actual truth was that there were 3 chapters, 2 in very good shape and the third not in quite such good shape. So we had a dilemma on our hands as to what to do. There was obviously not enough to publish as a book, and yet it seemed a terrible pity not to bring something out and to honour this woman that we all had known and felt so strongly about. So we decided that a collection of previous writings that were related in various sorts of ways to the chapters on the crocodile would probably work out quite well. And so I chose previous writings that I thought fitted with the theme of predation, of ways of attempting to communicate with non-human animals, and also with anthropocentrism, which was very much part of what Val was writing about as well. So the book was then divided up into 3 sections, the first being the crocodile chapters, and then 2 subsequent sections, each on human-animal relations in various ways.
We've heard a lot about crocodiles tonight. What did the chapter about Biribi, the wombat, tell you about Val and about wombats?
Well, it was the very first piece of writing of Val's that I read, and so I have a particular fondness of it, I think. And one of the great strengths of this piece of writing is that it is so very engaging. It's humorous and ironic, which she tells stories of Biribi, wanting to get into bed with her at night and practicing his mating rituals with her cushions and things like this, and playing wombat games with her, and of course discovering that human ankles aren't quite as tough as wombat ankles are. Along with this light-hearted sort of humour, there is a very deep philosophical argument about how we might communicate with something that is so very different from us. and that the wombat in fact initiated this contact and was able to move very easily between the two different worlds of the house and the bush, something which we of course find incredibly difficult to do. So all of these stories that are in the Biribi piece, I think, speak of Val as somebody very open to the animal other and very respectful of it. But also, you know, having to cope with a whole lot of difficulties around it. This was not an easy animal to share a dwelling with by any means.
Or a bed with.
No.
George Mayne, Val was a philosopher, but she was also first and foremost an environmentalist. In her writings, you see someone trying to explore the cultural foundations of the ecological crisis that we're in, the failure of modern society to adequately respond to the sixth great extinction event that we are now living, the first caused by humans. What sense did you get of Val and her environmental concerns?
Well, in relation to the work we do here, I think her and other environmental philosophers, in the way that they have so usefully critiqued Western traditions of understanding about human beings and the natural world and materiality, I think Val very usefully articulated how the material world and the ecological world have relentlessly been devalued by Western modern culture, and that is in many ways gives us insight into perhaps why our governments and institutions aren't responding in the way that scientists are very loudly telling us we need to respond in terms of scale to the climate crisis and the ecological crisis. Increasingly there are calls for civil disobedience, and I think Val's work really helps to understand why there might be this failure within our modern society to respond adequately, and once we have that understanding that she and other environmental philosophers offer, it does empower us to perhaps dismantle some of those cultural processes. And
is that why you see this canoe as subversive? Like you told me that it tells a story, but in another way it's quite subversive.
Well, I think in some ways, yes, museums are subversive in terms of subverting the quite entrenched stance within modern society towards materiality, because we, of course, collect things like this wonderful canoe in front of us, and the material characteristics, are valued by museums and are seen as actually holding stories, and they can communicate something to us. The very matter of the objects is valued and seen as having that capacity to tell stories. And I think with this canoe that's in front of us today, if we think of it in the East Alligator River, as the floodwaters were rising, as the crocodiles were increasing in number and collective power in that place, and as the storms were rolling in, we see quite a fragile object in front of us, made only of fiberglass and a bit of plywood. And I think that within that story, it tells us something about vulnerability, human vulnerability in place.
A metaphor for humanity.
Well, that's right, and that's very much how Val came to understand and respond to the experience, that ecological event that she experienced within this canoe at that moment in time, that she realised that she had felt invulnerable, but in reality she was vulnerable to the powerful natural forces of that place. And she drew on that realisation to offer a critique of modern society and our sense that we are somehow removed from the ecological order and invulnerable. And I think what climate change is, and the scientists are telling us, is that we are utterly dependent on natural systems and on the capacity of land to produce food for us, and that is beginning to unravel. So I think Val's work, her body of work, is offering something very useful at this moment in time.
So here in Microcosm, we hold the world in our hand.
Yes.
Graham Webb, look, let's get practical again. Graham, you're chair of the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, their crocodile specialist group. You have been since 2004 chair of that group. It's probably the most powerful body in the world determining the conservation future of crocodiles and alligators. You've told us an Australian story about how well we are doing here, but what's the global story? You know, we've just heard a story about ecological crisis. How are the crocs and how are the alligators doing in that wider world? And what is their biggest threat? Is it simply habitat loss, and for that you can blame us?
Yeah, well, there's really 23 species of crocs around the world, and they're in about 99 different countries. And so there's just a diversity of issues. Some situations are situations in which, like China with the Chinese alligator, where they're down to like 100 animals, they're putting a lot of effort into doing something, but it's way down very low. Others like Brazil with, an estimated 16 million black caimans. They got black caimans coming from everywhere. So the question there with the black caimans is how do you get people to live with these? Yeah, they're quite a big caiman. How do you get people to live with them? Some cases are cases where you need protection and you're not likely to have a big population. At best, you might end up with a token population. Thailand's a very good example. They've got, 600,000 Siamese crocodiles on crocodile farms, and they've got about 3 left in the wild. And the farming side, great. That's like a domestic animal. People use them as garbage disposal units. If you're the guy in the village that kills chickens, you feed it to your 2 crocs and then you sell the hatchlings on. That side's very successful, but it's not the side that helps conservation. Captive breeding is never the way to help conservation. It's conservation, you've got to try and use the wild population to put value in the wild population. And I think the points Deborah were making before, they're really quite different. I guess my key view is conservation. Why people want to conserve something, I couldn't care. Like if they want to conserve elephants because they sleep better at night with elephants, if they want to conserve elephants because they like eating elephant meat or they want their piano made out, doesn't worry me why, as long as they want to conserve them and you can get them to take action. Because if you try and convert, in science you've got to line up the problem and the solution at the right level of resolution. And if you decide, well, we're going to turn everyone's value system upside down before we can solve the problem, then it's never going to work, because you've got a solution, you've got a problem on a time scale of maybe 10 years and a solution on a time scale of perhaps centuries. So I have no problem at all with the people advancing the value systems and what they should be, as Val was doing and very forward in doing, but it's not necessarily the answer to today's conservation problem. I guess you see where I'm coming from there? I'd rather not sacrifice conservation because, who's going to kill all the cane toads? It's no good giving me someone that's opposed to killing anything. Who's going to kill them? Who's going to kill all the cats and the foxes that are killing billions of units of wildlife? So for conservation, you know, if you have someone that's opposed to the act of killing animals, well, it's like putting someone in the 100-metre dash that's in a wheelchair with their hands tied to the wheel. They can't do it because conservation requires killing. That's the problem. I don't have a problem with the development of the higher order thinking about how we should maybe and how we perhaps will in 100 years' time, 200 years' time, all think that way. That's legitimate thinking material, but it's not pragmatic conservation.
Deborah, over to you.
well,
Can I preface just the question, because I suspect you might go there, and Graham was alluding to it there. This sense that Val was on about the essence of the problem being a cultural thing for us, and that I wondered if there is a clue in how you were talking earlier about that Indigenous sense of having a framework where these other animals, these other creatures, rightfully belonged. And it was pragmatic, but there's also a sense that it's included in a wider world, a spiritual sense of not just us, but something beyond us.
one of the most interesting things to me that Val was working on at the time of her death was what she was calling philosophical animism. So she'd been fascinated, and we had a lot of conversations about animism, Indigenous animism. Animism is the view of the world that says that other creatures are sentient beings, that they have personality, they're persons, they have a self, a selfhood, they make choices, they act with intentionality. And that as such, it's a world that works, that is appropriately engaged with through forms of respect, rather than through forms of domination and disrespect, or domination and disregard. So what Val was interested in doing, and it's very similar to what she and Richard did in regards to the forests, where they wanted to find a philosophical answer to the question, what's wrong with chopping down a forest? So she wanted, rather than just pinch and appropriate and sort of, adapt Indigenous animism, she wanted to troll the Western philosophy and develop a philosophical animism. So an animism that was defensible within Western philosophy, that could be our animism.
Did she get there?
She didn't get as far as she would have gone. She's written about it, and I think there was a lot more yet to come. It's one of the things I really regret in losing her, that she knew where she was going. And she was, as Lorraine was saying, she was moving more towards, she was also getting the sense that she could do analytic philosophy to perfection, but she was very aware that your average person doesn't read it and wouldn't enjoy reading it even if it were on offer. So she was...
And that, as Graham says, there has to be a pragmatic outcome.
Well, yeah, if you
Or
want
a
to,
practical outcome.
if you would like your writing to reach people and influence them, then you have to put it into forms that people will enjoy reading. So she was moving more towards storytelling, more towards the kinds of engagements that Lorraine was talking about. And so she'd been writing some really interesting essays that were kind of exploring aspects of animism. So she's got one about stones. What would it mean to sort of think of a stone as something that actually acts with a certain amount of intention in the world? Really challenging philosophical questions dealt with in ways that they're actually quite accessible. So where she would have gone with that, I think she would have had a new incarnation actually as some kind of philosophical shaman. But that's my vision of the Val that I miss so much. Yeah.
I'm going to wrap this up with asking all of you for a final reflection on Val's legacy. And Deborah, perhaps I'll start with you. Was Val an outcast in her own land? Did we not recognise and value her enough?
Well, I think that's very true, and I know that Val thought it was true. And the most telling story that she told me, anyhow, was just saying that when she gave a talk at a conference overseas. This happened numerous times when she would be introduced as the person who'd survived the crocodile attack and was in the death roll 3 times and had extricated herself and written about it, and everybody would stand up and applaud. And when it was mentioned, this happened at places we've been, when she was mentioned as the person who'd been attacked by a crocodile in Australia, everybody laughed. And it really hurt her. And when you've heard George describe it, using her words, his description of that thing, it's not a laughable event, not in a million years. And so I think she felt that the people who most should be having a regard for her philosophy, because it's absolutely embedded in this continent, this wildlife, these places, these experiences, these animals. This is exactly the place where she was least listened to. But I mean, she does have a lot of friends who are quite committed, like the museum, to making sure that she's not forgotten and that she's understood better.
Lorraine, Shannon, for you, what's Val's legacy? Is it the writing? Is it the fighting? Or simply that Plumwood Mountain and a wombat or two are still there?
Well, what this discussion brings to mind for me is an image that I've kept in my mind from Val's funeral, when I took a moment and wandered away from everybody else into Val's vegetable garden, which I was well acquainted with, because every time I visited there was a list of jobs for me to do in the vegetable garden of dubious pleasure, like emptying the compost bin for her. But I discovered that Val had somehow got her hands on a job lot of bird cages, which were dotted all around the garden, protecting precious things. And I was very taken with this image, which seemed to me a perfect metaphor for Val's sense of the need to theorize and write and think according to her whole understanding of how we should dwell in this earth. And so here were these cages, which, you know, of course, a bird cage is made of wire, so it isn't a solid boundary. There is interchange that goes on between what Val was protecting inside rather than keeping captured, and all that was dangerous was the outside the cage, but always this sense of the possibility of communication and dialogue across this boundary. And also, of course, all these crazy bird cages were the most whimsical sort of image, so evocative of Val's creative ability in life, that when I think of her, I think of these mad bird cages and all that they signify, really.
George Mayne, how do you see Val Plumwood's contribution to an Australian environmental ethic?
I think her contribution is an extremely contemporary one. I think the mounting climatic and ecological crisis that we face makes her body of work in Australia and beyond these shores extremely relevant and useful. And empowering, I think, if we can grapple and grasp an understanding of those dynamics that are driving the problems we're facing, then, as I said before, we're empowered to do something about it. And I think that's an extraordinary legacy.
Graham Webb, has Val Plumwood helped the cause of the croc? She probably saw herself as a warrior on their behalf. Did she succeed?
Oh, I think she has. When I think of Val, I think firstly that she should never have actually been in a canoe there. That was out of her hands, you know, that she should have been, there shouldn't have been a canoe in the whole of Kakadu. So she was a victim of someone else's lack of foresight. When she did get attacked and came out with a strong philosophical position for crocodiles, at that time it was terribly important. Had she done the opposite and come out and demanded vengeance or something, at that time it could well have changed the way things went at that time, because it was a very sensitive issue in the north. And then in the end, a contribution like as we struggle with how we relate to the natural world, and as we look at the way various peoples do and don't do with success and with failure, wherein there is a role for people to bury into the philosophy of what we're doing. I don't think it's necessarily going to solve the pragmatic problem of how do we conserve what we've got, but it's the right way to be advancing. So their contribution in that field, which is very highly regarded, is clearly something of national and international value.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like a rousing Canberra thank you for Graham Webb, George Main, Lorraine Shannon and Deborah Birdrose, who have all been fantastic panellists tonight, The Eye of the Crocodile for Radio National's Big Ideas. Thank you. That was sweet applause. We love it. We love it when we get that on tape. We just sort of put it on loop.
Well,
Thank you very much for coming out on a Tuesday night in Canberra. I don't know about you guys, but I enjoyed myself immensely. I learned a hell of a lot, and I really appreciate our four guests putting themselves out and coming out tonight. Thank you.
Well, and I'd also like to add our thanks, of course, to Greg for doing a fabulous job facilitating the discussion and for being involved tonight. So thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
We still didn't hear that crocodile story, though.
Not in public.
Probably right. At the drinks afterwards, maybe. Now, we're a little bit pressed for time, so I think what we'll do is just move ahead to the actual launch of The Eye of the Crocodile. But obviously, we will perhaps have time after the formal proceedings. If people have questions, we can have an informal discussion down over our refreshments. But before we get to that part of the evening, I've got great pleasure in introducing Professor Kate Rigby, who's going to actually launch The Eye of the Crocodile. Kate is Professor, I think Foundation Professor of Environmental Humanities in the School of English, Communications and Performance Studies at Monash University. She is a scholar of an astonishingly broad background, I think. She's worked in German studies, in European philosophy, in literature and religion, and culture and ecology, and is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. It's really fair to say that Kate's played a very important role, together with others of our panellists, in developing the field of the ecological humanities in Australia, an area of scholarship that builds strongly on Val Plumwood's work. I'm not going to list all her publications and contributions. That's what Google is for. I think it's important, though, to point out that Kate also has a fabulous kind of longer association with the National Museum, as she was a visiting fellow in our research centre here back in 2008, I think. So please join me in welcoming Kate to launch the book.
Thank you. And I have to say thank you very much to Greg and the panel. It was really marvellous. And I'm so pleased, Lorraine, that you mentioned Val's whimsy and sense of humour. And I can just perhaps add to that, one of my favourite memories of time spent with Val was when we collected cicada shells and made cicada shell necklaces. And the idea was that we'd actually go to a disco wearing cicada shell necklaces, which we never got around to doing, sadly. But well, look, it's a great honour to be launching this beautiful book. But I must say I do it with mixed feelings because it does rather bring home to me the shock of Val's death. We weren't expecting it. It was premature. And also the grief of losing a dear friend and a fabulous mentor, sometimes a challenging mentor, somebody who would always make you think and think again and think again. And that grief was also compounded by the disappointment that Lorraine also mentioned when we discovered how much more work Val had to do on this book, which was so important to her. It was probably never going to be an intellectually groundbreaking book, such as her first monograph, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature. But it was very important to her, and I'm sure very important for her readers throughout the world, and also a book through which she hoped to reach many more readers, a wider audience. And I very much hope that this book does, even though it's not the one that she had been wrestling with. And she really, goodness knows how long she had been prefiguring this book, perhaps, from the time she was convalescing in hospital, having had her world and her worldview, her life turned upside down by that crocodile, whom she viewed as her mentor, as her teacher in many ways. But it was one that she had great difficulty writing. She really, really was wrestling with this book as she had wrestled with the crocodile. And so perhaps it's not surprising that she didn't get further than she did. But it was also, I think it was also a book in which she was, as Debbie mentioned, exploring a new way of writing. And she'd started writing about literary language and a radical green writing project, as she framed it on one occasion, of using prose narrative, of using lyrical language in a way to restore agency and intentionality to what she called the silenced ones, to restore communicative capacity and moral significance to our earth others, as she referred to them, not only animals, not only plants, but even, and perhaps especially, stone, as we've heard. And if you read this book, you'll discover that stone, a particular rock, played a very important part in the experience that she had on the river that day. And I'm not going to tell you about it because I want you to go and read it. So this is it's not the book that she had intended, but it is far, far more than we feared, and that is thanks to Lorraine. In addition to the 3 chapters that Lorraine managed to find amongst her files, there are 4 other wonderful essays that Lorraine has selected and edited. And the book is, these are preceded by an introduction that was co-authored by myself and Debbie, and philosopher Freya Matthews, who sadly couldn't be here tonight, but Freya has, I think, inherited the mantle of being Australia's preeminent environmental philosopher since Val's death. And so we've written a little introduction, and it includes a little bit of biography, and we thought a great deal about this and how much to say and what to say. It's a poor substitute for the memoir, which we're all very sad Val never wrote herself. But we wanted to give a little bit of a glimpse, a little bit of a sense of the way in which her thought was embedded and embodied in her life. In a life that was fraught with tragedy and loss and grief, but which didn't leave her in any way embittered, and a life that was incredibly well lived, if sadly too short. Incidentally, Dominic Hyde has just brought out an intellectual biography of Val and Richard, her second husband. So if you get interested, you might want to have a look at that as well. I want to thank Debbie and Freya for their significant contribution to this book, and to honouring and building on Val's legacy. And it's a personal thanks too, because they're two of my other great mentors. I want to also thank Val's executor, Jeremy Russell Smith, for strongly supporting this project and for all the work that he's doing as her executor. I also want to thank Anne Edwards, who's already been mentioned, who has been taking care of Val's home, her land, and her non-human companions, and for helping to make Val's computer available to us and so on. I'd like to thank ANU ePress for taking on the publishing of the book, and of course the National Museum for hosting this event and allowing us to launch the book here. But above all, I want to thank and also congratulate Lorraine on the fabulous job that she's done in editing this book. And I just want to close by commending it to you. You can buy a beautiful hard copy from the bookshop in the museum. You can also get it from the ANU ePress. And I do hope that you will read it and tell others about it, and that the words will fly forth into the world and contribute to doing the work of cultural transformation that Val dedicated her life to. So thank you very much for being here.